All yours.
All right.
Oh, and sharing.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to share screen. Share is disabled.
There you go. You got it. I just turned it on.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're going to continue if I can get this working. Slide. Let's see. Can I view slides? View slideshow. Thank you. All right. So I think last week where we stopped off was Shemayim, right? If I'm correct. So just to kind of go over,
Yes.
we were exploring that Shemayim is the word used to describe the heavens, right? Now, also in hierarchical terms, heavens is plural, which means more than one. So what happens is how many heavens are there? Well, this begins to create a hierarchy, especially in a geocentric model like the ancient world believed in. That might trigger some people, but yes, they were geocentrists up until a certain point. We know, even in the Bible. Um, yeah, and so last I offered the thought that that Shemayim is actually a double word, meaning, or it's a compound word. Excuse me, I'm trying to remember my old schoolboy English. It's a compound word that means that uses the word Shema, which is height, and Mayim meaning water, which literally will be the high waters, which could connect to Genesis. But that's just a thought of mine. It's not. I'm not married to it, but it's just an interesting idea
Sure.
about the text, right?
Right.
Now, in I forgot the mouse wheel does that. um, so in Psalm 89, Heiser uses different words like Shemayim, uh, Kahel, Shachach. Yeah, who is like the Lord among the Benel, a God who is honored among the Sod Kadosh, the holy assembly, and is more awesome than all who surround him. Right. So a lot of words that Heiser is using to describe this heavenly hierarchy, because the whole point is he's using all these words to help construct using Psalm 82 and 89 as his springboard, and then using all these other words together. Michael Heiser is trying to construct for us a cosmological model with which we are to understand the text of the Bible and how and what it says about angels. That's kind of the ultimate goal. Because if we probably heard the good doctor before talk about how Psalm 82 was his one big epiphany verse when he was sitting in church. He says, like, a Psalm 82 was like, God stands in the presence of the gods, and among the midst of the gods he makes judgment. That's so weird. And so he went in that and turned a whole career into it.
Mm-hmm.
You can too for a small price of $9.95. That'd be a funny advert. But back to what we're doing here is that, but the idea is that there is like a group of these celestial beings, and there has to be a way that that group of celestial beings relates to Yahweh through the Hebrew Bible and into the New Testament, right?
Right.
So moving on. Now, another word with Shemayim is that how do we render holy ones, which are Kedoshim, right? Holy ones are holies, right? Literal plural holies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Heiser uses Job 15:15 to make a connection. So, from the New English translation and the Masoretic text, if God places no trust in his holy ones, but Kedoshab, even the heavens Shemayim are not pure in his eyes, right? So, God has trust issues with his holy ones.
Yep.
So what does that say about the relationship? Is that it could be that they are independent agents, right?
Right.
Is that the Bekedoshav can do one thing while Yahweh does another among in the realm of the Shemayim, right?
Right.
So that could tell us a characteristic and a function, or actually that could tell us about the nature. Remember what we said before about the nature, the function, and what they're called, and how those will tell us about how these things function. But you have the Bekedoshav here that have their own thing. And then there's another verse, I think it's in Zechariah. It's in one of the prophets where Yahweh speaks to the four winds, who are these angels in these chariots. And he says, I want you to go in this particular direction, but one chariot starts going the wrong way. And so Yahweh says, no, go that way. I said, go that way. And so he changes direction and goes the other, which is kind of funny, but it shows you how like they function among each other. Because was that angel being defiant? Did he not hear the orders?
Yeah.
That brings a whole load of questions as to how that all works, right?
Yeah. For me personally, just as uh, a personal injection here, uh, this verse in Job, um, there's another one. I think it's earlier in 14, or no, sorry, not 14. Job 4, 17 and 18, where it's uh, uh, Eliphaz having a night terror, and the demon that assaults him tells him the exact same thing, that the Lord doesn't trust his holy ones. And he says, so what makes you think he trusts you? Is the basic message. And it was at that point, I remember that day. I mean, I can still see where I was sitting, what I was reading, and I ran off to Susan and I'm like, this whole thing's a loyalty test. God doesn't trust any of these creatures, not angels, not us. He has no trust in any of us, and he's testing our loyalty. And it was literally what, maybe a chapter later, that Heiser said the exact same thing. He says, yeah, the whole thing's a loyalty test. I was like, see, there, that. So anyway, so that's what this triggers for me personally.
That would be so interesting. I mean, it's such a shame that Heiser has left us. But it would be interesting on that particular notion to get Heiser and Matthew Bates in a room
Yes,
to discuss the loyalty thing.
absolutely true.
Yeah.
I think it would be really interesting to hear Heiser sound off on that.
Yep, yep.
But
I
yeah, but
wish he was
sadly
here so
we
he could do that.
sadly we no longer can. So,
Nope,
so
gotta wait.
why? Why?
Angela, Heiser would win.
We'll see. We'll see.
That's funny.
Yeah. Now
He might.
Lexham. Yeah. Now we're going to tie back to this, but with the Lexham translation of this same passage, which is Michael Heiser's particular translation. Yeah, he says here, "Behold, God puts no trust in His holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in His sight."
Mm,
So in in English, these two translations communicate different connotations with it, but the principle is the same, right?
hmm
Now, while the impurity of the heavens, Shemayim, can be abstracted to mean that the spiritual world God inhabits has been tarnished in some way by the holy ones, the Hebrew parallelism makes it clear that the heavenly ones are not pure in God's sight. The apparent meaning is that the heavenly beings of God's host or council are imperfect, and so God cannot completely trust them. Heiser uses this to buttress his fallen watchers narrative. See Reversing Hermon,
hmm
which is a great book. If any of you have it or you want to read it, I highly recommend Heiser's Reversing Hermon, and especially it's also accessible to common evangelicals who are not well versed in theology at all. Um, yeah, it's a good fun book if you want to hear about the Watchers and all of that. Um, but the idea that the council is imperfect, not really sure what he means by imperfect, because that could mean that either they are incomplete, because perfect is a word of completion, or the fact that there is a flaw in them.
The possibility of rebellion, seeing as how some of them have.
Is it rebellion or is it just how they are? Because if Yahweh is the font of all everything, he created them to be this way.
Well, he created them with free will, like he created us with free will.
Of course. Now, but is it
So,
perfect free will? Is that free will a flaw or is it a completion? Because this would probably tie back into the imaging question about how much do they reflect the divine and the divine back. But what happens is in that relationship, Heiser's proposing there's a break. Yeah, Angela, mistakes aren't necessarily sin. Yeah, that's right. Um, yeah, but what happens is there's a break between, you know, in that reflection,
Well,
right?
the one thing I will point out is that we do have at least one, maybe two instances of human beings starting to bow down and worship angelic beings, to which the angelic being has a visceral reaction, almost a fear of don't fall down and worship me. And the fear seems to be double-edged, right? On the one edge is the fear of themselves that they may take that and run with it. The other one is the fear of Yahweh himself, that should they not immediately stop the worship of them, that Yahweh's going to, he's going to have some words with them about it, or something worse.
Could very well be. There's a lot off page, to try to suss that out. That's why midrash exists to explain some of these relationships, right? You know,
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of it's kind of theoretical because like all the stuff that's off page, we just kind of don't know.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
We can sit and speculate, but unless there's like a private revelation that someone says, I received a vision and angels told me that this is how the heavenly economy works.
Yeah.
Like is like, well, that's something to go off of, but also at the same time is that's something very personal.
Yeah,
You
Larry's
take it
making
with a
a
grain of salt. It's like, can I trust you? Or you want to illicit drugs? It's like,
right. Yeah,
what's
Larry's
going
making
on
a
with that?
great point about kind of like the Lord of the Rings characters, about them not wanting to deal with the ring because they have a deep fear of what'll happen to them if they get that thing in their possession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No one wants the ring.
Yeah. Yeah, even Frodo doesn't want it
No.
ultimately.
But that's why he was the perfect one to get it because hobbits don't desire power. So that
Yep.
completely negates the ring of power,
Yeah, 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 which
right? That
which
that, that was the
really,
big trick.
yeah, it takes me man, that's one I'm going to have to explore with the Noose book before I finally finalize it. Because that's the picture that I'm painting of Jesus in the Noose book, is that Jesus is the utter opposite of Adam. Adam is trying to reach out and take what has not been offered to him, or he's not ready for. He just wants to go ahead and take it, where Jesus lives in complete subjection to his Father, being obedient and just receiving whatever his Father gives him, trusting that his Father will only give him exactly what it is that he needs to get the job done,
Right.
interestingly enough. So, yeah, so God's got problems with angels.
Yeah.
And how do you
Lots.
define imperfect?
Yeah. So yeah. So that's me being a very nitpicky English guy, right? Very nitpicky Anglo. I was like, what do you from whence do you mean by imperfect, right? What do you mean by imperfect? Because I mean, if you want to get really freaky with it, it's that, well, there's seven classes of angels, which is 490, and then seven is has a gematria value that equals this. Even though 10 means fullness, but like 7 times 10, whatever. And get into that. If you want to get really deep into it, it's like we can sit and suss that out, but that's beyond our scope.
We shouldn't do that.
All the rabbit holes, Larry. All the rabbit holes. So my comment on this is that Shemayim and holy ones are obviously different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because Heiser, from what I'm reading in the book, Heiser's kind of collapsing the two, or I should use a better word, converging
Mm-hmm.
holy ones and Shemayim. But it's that Shemayim is the where, the holy ones are the who that live there, right? It's this Kedoshim. Because the Kedoshim are not Shemayim. Yeah. Now, also, is there anything to substantiate a connection in ideas between the temple scribes and the Zadokite Essenes? Right.
What do you
Because
mean?
what happens is the idea of these holy ones or the Kedoshim having a big apocalyptic role. We get that from the Zadokite Essene literature, which is Jubilees, Enoch, Songs of Sabbath Sacrifice, etc. That's what we read in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But from the Jerusalem temple, you don't really have much of that tradition being sussed out.
Mm.
So I was wondering, what's going on there, who's talking to who, because especially with the split between the Zadokite Essenes groups and the Jerusalem temple, you have two divergent traditions.
Yes.
Yeah. And especially the second temple, completely changes over with the Maccabean War,
Yeah, it almost
which
seems
will
like
create the Pharisees and Sadducees among the second temple priests.
yeah, it certainly seems that Jerusalem has a much different agenda
Yeah.
than Qumran.
Yeah. So that's where, and it keeps coming up to me because that's where you have well, it's applying the Bauer thesis. It's like you have Christianities
Hmm.
plural instead of Christianity singular in the first second century. Same thing with Judaism. Like there are Judaisms,
Hmm.
not Judaism TM,
Hmm.
right? Now the Maccabean Judaism and their stream is pretty much set up these which pretty much set up the Yavnian Judaism we have today,
Hmm.
formulated by Yochanan ben Zakkai to survive the temple collapse. But is that you have is that you have, who's the Gerizim people? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting.
Mm.
It's the Samaritan Jewish tradition, which is
Hmm.
divergent. You have the Zadokite Essenes, which is a divergent tradition. Of course, there's the Alexandrian Jews, which are a divergent tradition.
I was
They
reminded
talk to
that
the
there's
temple, but
Hasmoneans.
they are very Hellenized,
Yeah.
which means a whole nother worldview frame that they're operating in.
Yeah, I was reminded today that there's another group in there that I had almost let get off the table. That's the Hasmoneans.
Yeah,
They're attacking Jesus and they're linking arms together when they actually hate each other. And I forget exactly where in scripture that is, but
well, the
they're
Hasmoneans is another name for the Maccabees.
yeah, yeah, true, 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 true.
Because they will rule until they get supplanted by Rome, and then Herod is put in.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So Judaism was a dynamic thing. It's not, like a once. and it's been that way the entire time. It's like it changes as it goes.
So are you pointing at a thought that would be where do we draw the lines with who is a source? Are we how far do we stray into the all of the various sectarian groups of Second Temple uh, before we completely run afoul of core scripture? Is that kind of the thought?
Well, the thought is that on these given topics, given the record has provided something, we just look at them as different voices talking about the same thing.
Okay,
Yeah,
fair enough.
you have okay. This is going to get a little technical, but I'll walk you through it. So, when I went to college at UCF, we I took a my degree course was in interdisciplinary studies.
Mm,
Now, the curriculum allowed me to take like three different subject groups, right? But the principle behind interdisciplinary relations, is that you're not using one perspective in one way to solve problems or answer questions.
hmm
What you're doing is you're pulling from different views from different groups in order to answer the question or solve the problem.
hmm
Like, for example, when you construct a building, right? You have, because I do this at work all the time, you have the architect who designs the building. However, that in order to solve the problem of the building, and to put it in those terms, the architect also needs the mechanical engineering or the mechanical electrical plumbing discipline. They need the
hmm
structural discipline. They need the civil planning. Um, they need the civil planning discipline.
hmm
They need the jurisdiction. It needs the bureaucrats to approve things, right? So all of those disciplines come together to produce the building, right?
hmm
Which would be the finished product of the inquiry. So same thing, applying that idea to scholarly study and to round this back to our question, is that, well, think of it as think of the different disciplines would be the different views and doctrines that the different groups have, all sounding off on the one issue, which is the problem, to help give
hmm
us an idea of what's going on.
Sure,
Does that make sense?
it does.
Yeah, so the idea is you're not just pulling from a single stream, because for a long time in biblical studies is that all you had was the text of the Bible to pull all this stuff from. But
Mm,
now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, Nag Hammadi, we have
hmm
Codex Aleph and B, we have all this other material that's come out. We have all the archaeology. We have, even more stuff that we're just pulling out of the ground. Is that all of that goes into, we can apply that to the question of how do you explain historical Jesus,
hmm
right? And it's still a question that goes to this day, even over 100 years after Albert Schweitzer wrote his book, and even going back to the Tübingen school in Germany, the school of criticism and trying to historically look at Jesus. Is that we're downwind of all that, but the question gets very complex over time, and there's all these different perspectives, but we all come together to solve the issue of who is historic Jesus,
hmm
right? Now we can take that and we can easily apply that to the heavenly hierarchy, because we see this in angelic tradition, and I actually have a slide on this later. But what happens is that because a personal joke I have is that from looking at it, it's even on the subject of angels and demons both, is that the tradition is different every time it's approached and depends on who you ask.
Sure.
Yeah, there's no single consistent line that builds on itself, because a lot of it's speculation. Like even within Jewish tradition, like if, even even after Yavna, keeping things within the Jewish stream, the tradition is still changes and it's speculative at points.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really, we're not treating it like concrete revelation. It's that, well, maybe it could be this. It's
Yeah.
kind of fun to think about. Here's a fun story to go along with that.
Yeah, I've always wanted to. Susie and I watch those videos on where they're walking around Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or wherever. And one of the things that I picked up on very quickly was all the um, little posters and flyers and everything plastered all over the walls and the light poles and everything, advertising the different rabbis and yeshiva schools and everything. And I was like, man, I would love to go there and be able to spend just several years trying to figure out who on earth is who, what are they teaching, why is it that they differ from one another, and why? Because you can tell it's a competition. Everybody is competing because you send your sons and your daughters to the yeshiva. It's a private school, so you have to pay money for tuition for that. So they're all in competition against each other to try and get the parents to send their kids to that particular yeshiva. And I was like, I would love to go there and just spend a year, 2, 3 years trying to figure out what the difference is between all these guys.
Yeah, because even if you just read the Talmud, it's just a compendium of rabbis bickering with each other over minutia.
Exactly.
You know,
And it would be fascinating to see what all the little threads are in that tapestry.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So again, it's just the issue is complex.
Hmm.
Yeah, the issue is very complex.
Yeah.
Um, Even with the heavenly heart. Now the thing is, so far what I've been reading with Heiser in the Angels book, it's that there's not a lot of substrate to build on,
Hmm.
and that's kind of the issue. Excuse me one moment.
Yes, Larry, it does. It sounds like human beings splintering, dividing. I wish I had some elevator music.
Yeah, he's taking a call from his mother.
Oh, no worries. No worries. Just some filler.
I'll talk to her later. It'll be fine. All right. So sorry about that wait. Moving
Oh,
on.
no worries. No worries.
Okay. So stars, Kokebim. We are at a new word now. We're learning words like Dora and the Explorer. So, so the heavenly host or the heavenly ones are linked to stars as well. Now, like Lexham, which is Heiser's translation, Job 38, 5 through 7, which is one of his favorite verses, is who determined the earth's measurements, surely you know, or who has stretched the line upon it, on what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang the Kokebe Boker together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And then New English translation, Masoretic text translates that to B'nai Elohim. And so this is where he zeroes in on this last clause to come. Yeah, because what he's doing is he's using, the when the morning stars and all the sons of God. And it sounds like he's using that Granville Sharp rule where wherever there's an and, it's referring to the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Which is kind of weird, but it's that because the morning stars, Kokebe Boker, and the Ben Elohim are two different things. to the English speaker because it's one thing and plus and other thing.
Mm-hmm.
But in Granville Sharp's rule in Greek, Granville Sharp, says, oh, whenever there's an and or a chi, first thing and second thing, when used to describe someone or refer to the same or refer to two groups, refer to the same thing, right? So he'd be merging morning stars, Kokebim Boker and Ben Elohim, and saying, oh, see, there's a connection there between, see, the morning stars and the angels are the same thing. See.
So we essentially then can ask the question: Are they the same thing? Why must they be? What are the other choices? Are there any?
Well, that's why this meme was so artfully placed here. Because sometimes it's kind of a stretch. Now the thing is, he's not wrong that it is in the tradition of the ancient Near East and in the Greco-Roman world. Probably I'm not versed in Egyptian, but among the polytheist world there, it's that the gods are linked with particular celestial bodies.
Yes.
Yeah, like Ishtar is the morning star, which is Venus, and then you have Mars. Like we still name our planets that way.
Yep.
Based off of these gods.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, all the ancient temples are all um, uh, celestial uh, calendar tracking things.
Oh yeah.
And why are they doing it? Well, because that they're making the linkage between their gods and the stuff they see in the sky, because that's where the gods come from.
Oh yeah. And so even with yeah, so even and even with some, I think it's in the Cicero on the nature of the gods, talking about how the planets move in an orderly motion, right? He's using that as a proof for a higher world beyond us, right? How the planets move in an orderly fashion around us, right? Is that a man could not have ordered the planets to move that way, so there has to be gods, or you're literally insane. That's what Cicero says. He says, it's like I question your sanity if you say there are no gods. which is kind of funny, but it's like that's actually a really good point you bring up.
Yep.
But even later on in the tradition, angels get, because even in a Testament of Solomon, you have demons and angels that are tied to particular celestial bodies like constellations and things.
Mm-hmm.
Is that invoke the sign of Venus, or invoke the sign of Leo or something, and I run away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is that or is that I have my greatest power when I'm under this star sign, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these heavenly creatures, gods, Elohim, are tied to the celestial bodies. So now what happens is you tie this back to El being king among the stars, right? It's like, oh, that has to be his heavenly court. But is that is it being poetic or is he being literal? Because Heiser wants it to be literal. However, it sounds very poetic, because of course, if you are God, if you are the high God, and your throne is in the heavens, and especially as the planet and God Saturn, of course you're surrounded by the stars, and that's your court, because you rule the material world.
Yeah, is anything that stops it from being both literal and poetic?
It's just, I feel Heiser sometimes wants to force his conclusion, but I feel it's a lot easier to say that, but yet we have to do all this extra work around the side for some reason to arrive at the same conclusion.
Mm.
and we have to word it a very particular way. And that's what's so infuriating about Christians talking about this. It's like, because it's like, I guess it's because we're so scared that we sound pagan or
Mm.
polytheist that we have to, that it's literally the same but different. And I just think it's such a mental workload to try to work around this. It's like, dude, just it's fine. It's fine. Just draw a straight line. Boom, done.
Mm.
It's not hard. It really isn't, because all the gymnastics obfuscates what you're clearly trying to communicate. And I sometimes think that's done deliberately. Because then you can say, I still kind of don't understand. It's like, oh, well, that's the mystery of it all, isn't it? See how much higher it is that it's a mystery and we just can't
Mm.
understand it. It's like, that's a cop out
Yeah, yeah,
every
yeah.
single time. So,
Yeah, it's the reaching for uh secret knowledge for whatever reason. Because having that does something for us,
yeah.
which is never good. It's the stuff that's in public view where there's the capacity for falsification. That's
Yeah,
that's where the real meat lives.
exactly. And so is that we can more easily meditate on these things if you just define your terms and not
Mm.
obfuscate with all this extra work,
Mm.
right? But apparently it's an issue. It's just something I've noticed, like in apologetics and stuff. It's like we have to obfuscate because we have to come about it a completely different route, but it's literally the same conclusion because it takes the pagan 2 seconds to reach that, but it takes us 5 minutes.
Mm.
You know, I don't know. I don't know, but moving on, continuing here. So Heiser also will link this because of the language similarity to Isaiah 14, where the king of Babylon will raise himself above the stars of God Kokebim El. And also citing Ugaritic literature, there's a cognate Kokebim, however that sounds because it's all consonants, referring to the gods in El's council as an assembly of stars. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does the Ugaritic properly carry over and inform the Hebrew text? Do the stars clearly reflect or equal the Malachim? Is it being poetic personification? If El rules the heavens as planet and god Saturn, would it not be appropriate to say his court are the morning stars?
Mm.
So it could go either way. Now we have to get into the mind of the author of whoever wrote the text,
Mm-hmm.
which, unless you have a spare time machine laying around,
Mm.
or you can conjure them with a seance. I don't think we'll ever know for sure,
No.
right? But these are the different ways it can go. And in the tradition of talk about angels, these are different ways it can go. Because it can be poetic, it can be literal. It could be both.
Yeah.
All three are valid conclusions. But Heiser's going to double down that it's literal. He's going to
Okay.
take that route because he kind of needs evidence to say that, like, well, the Bible has to say something about angels in here. It's like, well, it doesn't say a lot.
Mm.
And even limiting yourself without Tobit, the book of Tobit and how they relate, or even cutting himself off from all the jubilees and um Enochian stuff, which has really good material to discuss this very question, but just cuts it out. It's like, well, you're kind of shorting yourself here.
Mm.
We've discussed that before.
Yeah.
All right. So Elohim, another word. So Gesenius in his lexicon helps with the breakdown. You have El, which is a generic word for God. Oh, the ancient Near East god El as a proper name, and it also could mean possessing might or a mighty one, right?
Mm.
signifying strength. And what's interesting is we actually found statuettes of El from the ancient Near East. This is a really nice one. See, it's gold covered.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a statue of El that we found. So that's what he looks like to his worshipers. Notice
Sure.
the Egyptian crown.
Yep.
I thought that was kind of wild because like the ancient Near East and Egypt have like similar art as you go up and down. I thought that was kind of interesting. And then you also have a golden calf here that's found in the Near East, right?
Yep.
So probably not as big as the one at Tel Dan, but it's significant. But both of those were symbols of representing that god El. And then even going into Rome and among the Greco-Roman tradition, that same god becomes Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Even to carry over from our last point, you see Aries the ram and Aquarius flanking Saturn here, showing that he is that he's tied to different constellations in the zodiac. So so these gods are tied to celestial bodies. Right. Yep. Now moving on, Elot, the feminine of the above, right? And then you have Eloah, which is a singular for a god, right? And then you have Elohim, which is the plural of Eloah, or divinity, divinities, right? Now, Sanchuniathon, in his Phoenician cosmogony, tells of Elohim, who are auxiliaries that are led into battle against the Titans by El, the high god. So how Sanchuniathon puts this apart is that he has the word Elohim, but it's an Ohim that's tied to El, right?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, so this god El, Saturn, is leading Elohim because the text says that explicitly. He says the auxiliaries of El, his Elohim, are led by him into battle.
Mm-hmm.
Go into the Titans by El, the high god, right? So that's one way to understand it, because these auxiliaries of him can ease, part of that is a heavenly court, right? Mm-hmm. It's his allies, it's his army. So and if you look at it, it's gods, demigods, giants, creatures of all, creatures with, godlike power, right? Mm-hmm. It's like those would count as Elohim. So you see how, so see even there, the term has broad application. Mm-hmm. Which Heiser wants to really nail down in us is that he like the word Elohim has a very broad application. It's not just, it could be, a disembodied spirit like this ghost of Samuel. It's the, it's the Shadim, it's the demons, right? It's the all these other things count as Elohim in the Bible, right?
Right.
So yeah, so having this parallel, even though he doesn't mention it, even though he's fine mentioning the Ugaritic, but mentioning this would help carry his idea that Elohim is broad.
Right.
Yeah, because the fallen watchers, they are Elohim, even if they're walking around on Earth.
Yep.
Right. Even their offspring could be considered Elohim. Right. Gilgamesh could be considered an Elohim. Right.
Right.
And I think, what was her name? She has this lecture series, Christine Hayes, or it might have been her lecture series, but she also talks about how Elohim could also be godlings. Or maybe that was Paula Fredrickson, but Elohim could also apply to godlings as well, if we understand that. Right. Now, Psalm 82 and 89, Elohim counts as gods, lower tier gods, members of a heavenly assembly. Psalm 89, could go to human rulers, cross-referencing John 10:34. But then I also found that Isaiah 41:21 through 23 also mentions that phrase, "You are gods." and has a completely different context. But Heiser wants to link it to Psalm 82. I don't know. The word is used in several different cases, giving multiple definitions based upon the context, right? So,
Right.
of course. It's just Elohim is a very broad word.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, Elohim also refers to supernatural spirit beings, which is the Shadim, Deuteronomy 32:17, the deceased Samuel, 1 Samuel 28:13, and the angel or angels of Yahweh, Genesis 35:7. Heiser argues Elohim is also singular in some cases. He takes umbrage as scholars use Elohim to show from the text that the Israelites were polytheists. Archaeology bears this out, but the text Heiser insists Elohim is a singular and a plural, like how we view the word moose or
Mm-hmm.
deer or something. It's like a singular plural, probably,
Mm-hmm.
is the best way to explain it in English.
Yeah.
But I kind of don't think so because if we have a singular Eloah or El, and then we have Elohim as a plural, it kind of undercuts that. But I guess because he ties it to, well, let's move on. I don't want to get ahead of myself.
Sure.
To quote him, in Psalm 82:1, the word Elohim occurs twice. The form morphology of Elohim is plural. The meaning semantics of the term, however, is most often singular. In the case of Psalm 82:1, both meanings singular and plural are present. The first instance of Elohim has the singular participle nisab, stands or to take one's place, as its grammatical partner. That the second Elohim must be understood as plural in meaning is indicated by the preposition in the midst of berecheb that precedes it. You can't be in the midst of a singular entity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you could go as like, well, God's sits in the midst of the gods, and in the midst of the gods creates judgment. He makes judgment, right?
Right.
There's a redundancy there, so I think so. He's using that to to make his case here. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Mm. I've never tried to consider it in terms of a hierarchy. Um, so uh, it's like when I read now through the New Testament and I see um, the English word you, Y-O-U, and I mean, for many decades, I have read that in the singular, right? But one of the things that it's interesting to point out is that a lot of times when the New Testament is using the word you, it isn't referring to an individual, it's referring to a group. It is in the sense plural in context. So he's talking to the church or he's talking about a group of people and he's referring to them as you in the sense that a southerner would say you all, right? Or y'all.
Yeah.
And so it starts me to wondering, um, you know, yes, take it at face value that Elohim there in Psalm 82 is attached to or allied with a singular verb, and then ultimately um, goes plural, you know, among the gods. So is it a higher order of uh, gods taking uh, their seat as a collective y'all? I don't know, but it seems reasonable to say no, no, it's singular Elohim because one of the things that I know from the divine name pattern that um, popped out at me a year or more ago is that Yahweh Elohim is singular. It's not saying Yahweh, who is one of the Elohim in the sense of a larger group. It's two descriptive uh, uh, words pointing at a singular entity, and one is a word of relationship, and the other one is a word of governance.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'd have to say that I largely come down together with Dr. Mike on the first one being God in the singular.
Now it could be a word referring to like the plural collective as a singular, right?
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I was pointing at. And some
Okay,
people would try to stretch that into plural of majesty, right? Which is
yeah, but
largely debunked at this point.
yeah, plural of majesty is a weird case.
Yeah.
I, yeah, biblical Unitarians like to use that, but I think they fell off using that anymore.
Yeah, yeah. It's largely been debunked. It's not a
Yeah,
real thing.
yeah. But to come back here to this verse is that you have, Elohim stands in the assembly of El, and in the midst of the Elohim renders judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's sort of how we would read that verse.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have the first Elohim and the second Elohim. Here's Baal, right? Or Baal, or actually, hold on, sorry, I'm rusty with my Hebrew.
What word?
It's this one.
Oh.
It's that's Bedot El. Yeah, the assembly of El.
Right.
Right. Yeah, Bedot El. Bikarev. Bikorev Elohim.
Yishput. Yishput.
Yishpot. That's a Tav. Yeah, that's a Tav. Yeah, Yishpot. Yeah. So thanks to my lovely wife, who is a Hebrew student, for helping this. Yeah, but you see in the verse here, you have two Elohims, right?
Yep.
But what happens is that, how do we translate that first Elohim? If we were to pare this down, how do we translate that Elohim, right?
Yep.
Now coming back to you, like Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh is an Elohim, but of course, Yahweh is a unique Elohim.
Yes.
Now, but there are times where Yahweh has that second title with his name.
Yep.
So it's like, it probably could be like the divine Yahweh or God Yahweh or Yahweh God. Could also be
Yeah.
other translations of it, or you know, Yahweh the divinities, or
Yeah.
Yahweh of the divinities, or Yahweh divinity, or something.
Well, uh within that divine name pattern, the thing that I've uh, come to notice out of that is, of course, is that when Elohim is used, it's always um, within a wider governing context.
Yeah,
So it's speaking of either all of them together in that governing context, the hierarchy, or it is uh, God Himself, but within the governmental context.
yeah,
And you find that with a lot with when the nations, the Goyim, the pagans are being addressed, or when they are the ones giving the address, they will generally, about 99.9% of the time, they will they will speak of Elohim because that's what they're used to.
yeah,
That's their cognitive context. Yahweh is not something within their context, so they
yeah,
don't use it.
right. Because also, what brought to my mind saying, the divine Yahweh, or Yahweh the divine,
Hmm.
Yahweh Elohim, if that can translate over, is that sounds like, a title you would give a king.
Yes.
Like when you
Yes,
greet
yes.
him, like when you greet him in court, it's like you have that, you know,
It's an honorific.
Yeah, it's an honorific. Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
So that Yahweh Elohim has that honorific construct, especially in the context you're talking about. So, is it that's in one of your books, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's a that's a completely divine name pattern.
Oh, so if I want to read about that, where can I see more?
Uh, one of the directories that you unpacked earlier from the zip file has a subdirectory called divine name pattern.
Larry, I'm handing you a shameless plug.
I know. I don't
You,
have a
you,
book on that.
oh, okay. Well,
I've,
you can
I've,
read
I've
more about it
never,
at
I've
Liberty
never
Lover
actually,
Substack.
I've got a lot of essays, but no specific book has yet
Oh,
been devoted to divine name pattern.
how about Liberty Lover Substack?
Yeah, you can do that.
Yes, so go see Larry at Liberty Lover Substack if you like more information on his divine name pattern.
Exactly. There's stuff in there.
All right. Shameless plug over. Back to our presentation.
Yes.
All right, so continued from the previous, and this is also to quote Heiser again. The plurality of the second Elohim in Psalm 82:1 is made obvious by Psalm 82:6. God tells the other Elohim, "You are gods, Elohim, all of you." Both pronouns "you" in the statement are grammatically plural. These Elohim are sons, plural, of the Most High, which is that Ben El, right?
Hmm.
That Ben El construct, who must be the God of the Bible, as there is none higher. Many scholars use these passages to argue that biblical writers were at one point in Israelite history were polytheists. This thinking is misguided and is rooted in a mistaken notion of what the word Elohim means. We tend to presume that the biblical writers thought about Elohim in the same way we think about capitalized God. When we see the word God, we instinctively assign a unique set of attributes, e.g., omnipresence, omnipotence, sovereignty, to the letters God. But this presumption is incorrect and leads our thinking astray when we encounter instances where Elohim is intended to describe a group of beings instead of the lone God of the Bible.
Yep.
Right. Now, what happens is that it, there's kind of a circle that Heiser goes into. I've noticed, right, is that we can't assign attributes to the letter God or Elohim, right? But if Yahweh is the only God that has those attributes, that's what makes him unique from the other Elohim.
Hmm.
And so, but then we can't just ascribe attributes to him because then we don't understand what an Elohim is, and then it just kind of goes in a loop.
Mm.
Which is so I would go about this different. I would explain this differently, but his point is, his ultimate point is that we can't, like, Elohim has broad application, and he would have saved maybe 60 pages if he just said that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that among the celestial hierarchy, Elohim has a broad application.
Yeah, and define it within the context that it's being used.
Exactly. Exactly.
Which, of course, we get hurt by English because English makes that choice for us um,
But
repeatedly.
also this English is born out of the Christian worldview.
But, well, no, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So all of the beautiful context that is there that would help you understand what Elohim is within its context has been stripped out
Yeah.
and put through the gristle mill of whatever Christian tradition that the translator or translators
Yeah.
have running between their ears, and then it
Yeah.
just comes out in English, and then we get taught downstream of that. So suddenly we are disconnected from it. And so when we start talking about this kind of stuff with most common folks sitting in pews, they're looking at us like bullfrogs in a hailstorm. You know,
Yep.
like what do you mean? What are you talking about?
Yeah, because what happens is in English is that we assign God the word and letters God to Yahweh through the Christian tradition. And that's
Correct.
how we understand how divinity works. It's like he's the only God because of monotheism. Is that, well, then how do you describe the one God? Is that, and then
Yeah.
he has all these properties, right?
Well, this is one of the beauties of using a translation like the Orthodox Jewish Bible. One of the ways to get rid of that is to simply use the Hebrew, the transliterated Hebrew word in English letters and look at the reader and say, okay, you're going to have to do a little bit of work here to figure out Elohim in its context. We're not just going to hand you God or Lord or whatever. We're going to give you Elohim. We're going to give you Yahweh. And we're going to put you in a position of doing the labor to figure out what exactly is that pointing at? Is that pointing at uh, the what we typically think of capital God, or is it something else?
Yeah, because we've also been ingrained through the Christianity that there is no other God
Hmm.
in the cosmos.
Yeah, 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 which is why we're repulsed by lowercase God,
Yeah,
and we can't that was Heiser's aha moment in church that morning. What is a pantheon doing in my Bible? Because he was
exactly.
steeped in exactly that thinking.
Because even in the Greek world, understanding, theos,
Hmm.
like theos has broad application even to Greeks.
Yes.
It's not a big deal for them because
Yep.
like pretty much anything more powerful or higher than a human, is a theos,
Yep.
right? Now we carry that into English, which is steeped in Christianity, is that there is no other theos. There is only one theo,
Hmm.
and that's what our cosmos is.
Hmm.
And then, which is why it's so weird when we get into discussions about the Trinity, or what do we make of angels and demons then.
Hmm.
And then at that point is that we just abandon, like, yeah, there is the one God, but then there are these other spirits, and then we're functional Zoroastrians.
Hmm.
So it's a lot of, and
Mm.
so that kind of feeds into the kick the can down the road on, what are angels and how they function in our cosmos.
Yeah.
Same thing with demons and stuff. We just kind of take it for granted they're there, but we can't bear the thought that they are considered Elohim,
Hmm.
because it just doesn't come into our framework, and we just can't, you know because if you ask an Englishman, there's only one Elohim.
Hmm.
There's only one Eloah, that's Yahweh, right? So
Yep.
so it cuts us off. So yeah, so this is where, when Walton talks about the different cultural rivers, right?
Yep.
Yeah, it talks about the different cultural rivers, and so we're swimming in the Christian cultural river here in England and and in America. But what we have to do is we have to understand the ancient Near Eastern Greco-Roman worldview to
And which
understand this text.
which leads into the question that I got asked on Wednesday afternoon, which is, well, why do I need all of this ancient Near Eastern stuff? Why? Isn't what I have good enough? Isn't my Christian tradition just peachy keen fine? And my answer is, yeah, for as far as, the jalopy will take you.
Yeah,
But if you want to go further, if you actually want to run the Indianapolis 500, you're going to have to put away your Model T, and you're going to have to actually get a roadworthy vehicle to run the race. And yes, that means you're going to have to bite the bullet and study the ancient Near Eastern thinking, because that thinking is what wrote this book in its
yeah,
original language, in its original context, not your
yeah,
English and not your 21st century high school education.
exactly. Because it was kind of like it was a full replacement to where, as an American Christian, it's that the Bible almost takes like a timeless category, right?
Mm,
And so we don't consider the Hebrews and the ancient Near Eastern stuff because we just have the Bible.
Well, the Spirit gives me the interpretation.
Well, that's one way to take it, but it's that we are detached fully from as Americans, we are fully detached from the Greco-Roman and ancient Near Eastern
But I don't need
culture
that. The
and
Spirit, this,
worldviews.
no, the Spirit
So
tells me.
yeah, so we have to interpret it within our cultural lens and what it means and how it applies to me as an American Christian,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so we begin right out of the gate as an American detached from the world and the meaning behind what Christianity was originally supposed to be intended by Jesus
Mm-hmm.
and in his context and in his world and what all of those meant. And so that's a hurdle we have to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why, Dr. Heiser and Walton are heroes
Yep.
for trying to get us, trying to introduce this to the mainstream. But it's just, don't be careful how you approach it because, you could be like Mike walking up and, Sunday morning and say, hey, you want to talk about aliens? And like, then that's it. Right, Mike? Oh, he's got his thing off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't lead with the aliens thing.
Right. But, if I was going to talk about aliens, I would say, there's been no evidence of aliens. You better look at them being fallen angelic beings. So, and even then, a few of them would look at me like I got two heads.
Yeah.
But, even if there are aliens, it's not going to change anything about the theology of the Bible.
Right. Which is why
No
instead of
matter
that, you
what
leave it.
Steven Spielberg said.
Right. Yeah. See, this is why you approach them with flat earth and not that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because believe it or not, yeah, because it's wild, but there's Christians that believe that.
Yeah. And I even had one when I told him that, it was three guys that, well, one of them had been to the moon and the other two on the shuttle. And I said, these three guys are Christians. They have testified that the earth is spherical. They've seen it with their own eyes. Are you going to call them a liar?
He is,
And
because the Bible
he
says that it was a
said, I have
rakia.
no problem doing that.
I know. It's misplaced.
Yeah.
It's very misplaced. But we pray for them. They'll come around someday, hopefully. Or, there's that verse is like they were just, set in their delusions, right?
Yeah. Just need to send them to Antarctica and let them see the 24-hour sunlight that happens about 4 months out of the year around, in the winter,
I'm sure
which
they'll
is
still find a way around it.
their summer.
I'm sure there's some that will still find a way around it because there's.
Oh, some of them do, because there was a group that went and some of them changed their minds, and a few of them kind of held on but quit talking about it, and some of them doubled down in their cognitive dissonance. So, it's just.
That cracks me up. All right. I'm going to kind of go to my last slide here and we'll conclude for the night and we'll probably have another half hour for questions or fun discussion.
Sure.
I appreciate you all being with me for this.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this is fun. I love talking about these things. All right, so continued from the previous quote. We know this presumption about Elohim is mistaken by virtue of how the biblical authors use the word Elohim. Briefly, one will find Elohim in the Hebrew Bible employed to describe spiritual beings that are clearly lesser than the God of Israel. While Elohim is used thousands of times for the singular God of Israel, it is used for spiritual beings judged by the God of the Bible, Psalm 82:6. It's like, can you use a different verse, please?
Yeah.
We get the Psalm 82 thing. We
Yeah.
got it. Give us something else, please. Anyway, gods and goddesses of the surrounding nations, Judges 11, 1 Kings 11. Territorial spirits, Hebrew shadim, often translated as demons. That's Deuteronomy 32:17. And the spirits of deceased people, which is 1 Samuel 28. That's Samuel's ghost and the witch of Endor. Right. And we just discussed that, how Elohim has broad application, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, Heiser would have probably saved 60 pages if he just said that. Anywho, Yahweh is an Elohim, but no Elohim is like Yahweh, to paraphrase the doctor. There has to be a unique way that Yahweh is different. Heiser says that he is the highest, which gives us nothing but a set of attributes to give him distinction. These attributes get attached to Yahweh, who just is God, within an exclusive monotheistic systematic. If you want more information about exclusive monotheism, see Greer, World Full of Gods. It creates a loop inside the system that will need mental surgery to broaden the Elohim landscape and cosmological model. So lots of words just to say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
That Elohim has broad appeal. Or, excuse me, broad application.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and then this J.D. Greer's, no, is it because J.D. Greer's a theologian, but there's this other Greer guy. He wrote this book called A World Full of Gods, and he discusses in detail variant ways to approach a polytheistic worldview. And one of those is an exclusive monotheism. Because you have inclusive monotheism, which is that there is one God, but all of us have different definitions of who that God is, even though it's the same one. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if I'm talking to some guy and I say, well, I worship Yahweh. And he says, oh, you mean Cthulhu? He's like, what? No, I mean Yahweh. He's like, yeah. Well, we're both describing the same thing. It's just I call him Cthulhu.
Right.
Just to use a wild example, right?
Right.
But that would be considered an inclusive monotheism, right? But with exclusive monotheism, is that your cosmos has one God, that's it.
Right.
Right? There's no variation between cultures, that there's one God, that's it.
Yep.
Right? And that's where Judaism, Islam, and Christianity come out of. So it was kind of to explain that. Now, does anyone have any questions?
So in terms of the book Angels and Elohim, why is it, do you think, from your point of view, that Heiser is including uh, this entire discussion on Elohim? What does he get for the trouble?
What he's trying to do is use a hierarchy, because Elohim is an umbrella term, and we beat that to death in this presentation alone.
Sure.
But among the Elohim, there are different categories of these Elohim, or I'm sorry, I should say different kinds.
So we're
of
building
Elohim.
a skeleton upon which to form it into a hierarchy to hang
Yes.
these guys.
Yeah, because this is still chapter 1, mind you.
Oh yeah.
This is still chapter 1, but what he's doing in chapter 1 is he's trying to build his substrate to construct his tower of where angels are, pulled exclusively from the Bible. But of course, he's not, because he has to borrow from Ugaritic and other things.
Mm.
But it's the Bible, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, even though I have to use Ugaritic to plug a hole.
Which is not terrible.
Well, it's not terrible. It's just, it's outside of your parameter that you set for yourself.
Mm.
And that's what you're presenting us in the text, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yes,
If you're
yes,
saying that it's our scope is the Bible, but yet you step beyond it, then
yeah,
you're being a little disingenuous.
exactly. That's the issue I have. Now, if he said is that, well, I'm this, because if he says is that I'm not going to really limit, I'm going to use the Bible as my focus, but I'm not really going to limit myself to the Bible, because in the greater Jewish and ancient Near Eastern tradition helps us plug theological holes to help us build this.
Yeah.
It's like, if he said that, fine, right?
Mm.
But it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's fine.
We can
Yeah,
we can actually take it that way. We can allow him what it is that he's done, but we can actually do the labor of, okay, let's form up the ancient Near Eastern overall picture, both
yeah,
pagan and Hebrew, and then let's see where we land when we start uh, pulling in canonical 66 books.
right. Because even from Egypt to Syria and Babylon,
Mm-hmm.
you have a very similar religious tradition.
Yes.
Yeah. They
The
all talk
polemics
to
are
each other. They
different.
all use similar art. They all use similar temple styles.
Yep.
And so is like, so their religion is generally the same, and they pull from a big context, even though there's variation within the tradition for particular cultures. You can still find all the common theological themes that they have among each other,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so to couch the Bible in that is that, well, what do you make of this exclusive monotheism? Like, where does that come from? Where is Yahweh alone, and that's it?
Right.
The Yahweh alone cosmos.
Yeah.
And reading Eisfeld's paper was kind of interesting, because, and Mark S. Smith carries this along, where the idea is that as Yahweh worshiping Israelites met El worshiping, I don't think it's Bedouins, but it's, whoever, like these type. There's a particular group of Arabs that was around like the Sinai Peninsula and Haran and stuff, and we get that from text of the Bible too, like where Yahweh comes out of Paran.
Sure.
And is
Well,
that yeah? Is
you
that
get Joe, you get Yahweh coming, or at least El coming up out of Seir, where Job is at.
Well, what's
Um,
interesting is Mount Seir is where the Edomites worshipped.
yeah.
Right.
That was
Yeah.
that was their high mountain.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where they worship Kos, possibly,
Mm-hmm.
because we archaeologically actually have found like one Edomite text that dates to ancient Edom, and it mentioned this. I think it mentions Kos, right?
Mm.
And so they think that is the name of their high god, which it also could be their name for Yahweh,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't know. It's only speculative, because we only have a fragment
Mm.
of what that text was.
Right.
So until we find more, we're just stuck.
Yeah.
But it's just an interesting thing. But all the same, is that Eisfeld proposes that when the Yahweh priests met the El priests and the peoples mixed in the area, El and Yahweh just kind of converged into one, to where the names El and Yahweh became synonymous with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what Eisfeld proposes.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, kind of going to the point is, oh, okay, Larry, have a good dinner.
aw,
Um, One of the things that's interesting is that I had mentioned to a person I was talking to this last week that um, his complaint was, well, are you telling me that uh, that Israel and Israel's God is downstream of pagans? And I said, no, that's not what I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is that if I'm perfectly comfortable with Yahweh Elohim being um, uncreated, unique, and the rest of the gods being created, and they're the ones who are mimicking, but it's not beyond Yahweh Elohim to take things from the surrounding culture and rebuild it, repurpose it, and use it. And I said, if you want proof of that, you look no further than the war tent of Pharaoh that is almost identical in construction to the tabernacle. The tabernacle is kind of a rinse and repeat of Pharaoh's war tent. So you tell me you're living in a people that has just been yanked out of Egypt. They're steeped in Egyptian teaching and religions and everything. Moses is trained literally to be a Pharaoh high priest of Egypt and goes out into the desert, stomps around for a number of decades, gets sent back, pulls the people out, and the next thing you know, he's getting instructions from Yahweh on how to build a tabernacle, has that thing built, and oh, by the way, it seems to look an awful lot like the war tent of his Pharaoh days. So you tell
right. 'Cause
me, who's in the lead? Is God repurposing something from the Egyptians, or are the Egyptians mimicking God, or is it both at the exact same time?
Well, it also could be that they just have a shared cultural tradition.
Right.
Because even Solomon's temple, like it tells you in the text that like Phoenician builders were hired by Solomon to construct the first temple.
Sure.
So so that so it would mat so that temple would naturally have a Phoenician style architecture,
Right.
right? Now, but then the thing is that tradition is similar to what we get all across the ancient Near East and Egypt,
Yeah.
right? Where you have the forecourt, you have the holy and the holy of holies, right?
Yeah.
It's like you see that all over the ancient Near East. So it's within a cult. It's within the Canaanite cultural frame.
Right.
So it shouldn't shock us that all these things are very similar.
Yeah, but so the interesting piece of that is kind of the next well, within that context of that same conversation was, well, why do we need all this, ancient Near Eastern stuff? Why isn't my 21st century, 20th century Christianity good enough as it is? And I'm like, I don't even think you're listening to yourself.
No.
I'm telling you that these people are ancient Near Easterners all the way through and through. This is how they think. This is what they do. This is why they do it. And Yahweh Elohim, inside of the context of Israel, is doing things that is not completely out of step with the surrounding ancient Near Eastern pagan cultures. It's just not. It's one of the reasons that they're constantly slipping off into worshiping the gods of the nations because they're so closely related to each other that that stuff kind of weaves itself in over time as they're, intermarrying, trading, selling and buying and doing whatever, or just sharing the same lands next to one another with their herds and their animals. And they're cross-pollinating each other with ideas. And the next thing you know, the Hebrews are starting to bake in their the ideas from their pagan neighbors. I mean, we already see it Aaron, Moses isn't even off the mountain. And what is Aaron doing? He's constructing a golden calf and saying, "Oh, this is, in celebration of Yahweh."
But Aaron had no idea it would become a golden calf.
Oh, I
It just appeared
know.
by magic.
Poor guy. Yeah, yeah.
He's
But
the victim.
that's kind of the point, isn't it? Is
Right,
that
right, right. Because again, they're steeped in that. They're just steeped in that context because especially with the Song of Moses
Mhm,
and describing Yahweh as with the strength of a bull he pulled us out of Egypt. Like all of
mhm.
that's El imagery.
Yeah.
So them making a golden calf when Moses is gone, is like, we want to thank our God for liberating us from Egypt.
Mhm,
How do we do that? Because we have no instructions in cult, because we don't know what happened to Moses. And then so it's like, okay, so we're going to make a golden calf statue to represent Yahweh. But then Yahweh says, no, how dare you make a golden calf statue of me? I'm not represented by a statue.
right.
Which is weird. It's a weird thing in the cultural context, in the religious context of those peoples. But then at the same time, that carries the thing is that, well, I'm not represented by a statue image because you, the people, are my image.
Mhm.
You, the people, are my iconia
Yeah, exactly.
or iconoi or whatever the plural for that is. I'm not a Greek scholar.
Give me a second. I'll be right
You, the
back.
people, are my icon, not this. But then, of course, a lot of the text against idolatry is a straw man. Um, they're not actually worshiping their statue; they're worshiping what the statue represents. Um, but the Jews don't understand that relationship. But at the same time, is that because through that Exodus story, Yahweh says, "I am not one of these ancient Near Eastern gods. I am unique. I am different." Like
Yeah.
the Jews are supposed to be unique and different from all the goyim,
Right.
right? So, and then especially it's that even with like the kosher laws and things that not wearing the mixed fabrics, not wearing, yeah, is that you are supposed to be a distinct and separate people
Yep, yep,
like me. You reflect me
yep.
that way.
Yeah, the mixture is headed towards um breaking the order that God has set and arranged. For whatever reason that He's set and arranged the order, the disordering that is the sin.
Yeah,
So,
because what is disorder?
mhm. It's chaos.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's where we start way back in Genesis. It's chaos being brought to heel and set in order. And you have the beginnings of the entire story from Genesis to Revelation with everything in between. Yeah, I just was really curious to understand that uh Elohim getting brought into view in a book about angels. So it just seems very simple that it's the framework upon which to hang the stuff that is coming,
Yeah,
or at least partly.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's just like it's just from looking at this, it's that even though he's building the substrate, it's that there's not a lot of information on angels at this point in time
Hmm.
of the tradition. We don't have a lot to go off of.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Because even if you, yeah, even if like it's Testament of Solomon alone, that was my view. Like the text of Testament of Solomon, or if you go with even a pre-Babylonian date for the Old Testament or the Torah,
Mm.
you don't get much.
Yep.
You don't get much in the tradition, and so you're trying to pull a lot of this out of it, where probably it's just not there, honestly. And
Or
that's what I,
it's
and that's what I worry about where this is going. Because
yeah,
so far a lot, it seems like his whole case is made in chapter 1 and that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
but he has a
maybe it's
whole book. He has a whole more of the book to discuss this. But
sure.
yeah, I mean,
Well, and maybe it's simply, and minus the book, maybe it's just that the idea is there's things that they understand, meaning, Moses specifically and Israel, uh, coming all the way up through Abraham into Egypt and landing in Moses and the Exodus story. Maybe there's plenty of things that they understand. The reason that they're not saying certain things is because they don't have to. What they're saying is already freighting a lot of ideas that don't, in their minds and in their world, they don't need to say them because their surrounding culture is already saying it for them. So it may be that it's not un um, that it's not a bad thing to lean into the surrounding ancient Near Eastern culture to kind of get your wits about you for all of that. And then once you have the surrounding culture, then you can start to name the unnamed.
yeah,
And so maybe from that point of view, you're right. Maybe, Dr. Mike is reaching too far, trying to make a case that would be better made to just say it out, just like that, is say they already knew these things. They didn't have to talk about them because that was already in their head. It's like the whole, you know, separate keeping modern Jews keeping meat and milk separate. They do it like, oh my God, you can't, you've got to have two whole separate halves of the kitchen, one side for dairy, the other side for meat, because, oh my God, if they touch each other, then it's awful. God is angry. And really all it was is that the meat and the milk thing was all about pagan idol worship. And he just simply didn't want them falling into the pagan idol. They didn't need to tell that story. We had to learn that story from other sources in ancient Near Eastern evidence, and then kind of take the meat and milk thing and plug it into that equation and go, oh, now I get it. Yeah, that's why they're not, he's telling them not to mix meat and milk. It's not because there's anything intrinsically bad or evil about mixing meat and milk, but once you put it into that that pagan god worship, well, then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, I get it. You start doing that, you're probably getting sucked into that paganism, and he doesn't want you to have that to be an avenue.
yeah,
So,
yeah. But it's just you have to take all of that and then translate that to 21st century America.
right. And it's hard. It's not easy.
It's monumental. Like the more I study the cultural divide between us and the ancient Near East, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, it seems like it's,
It really is.
Mount Everest.
Yeah, because it almost leaves me with the impressions that America had to create its own Christianity using the bones of Protestantism,
Hmm.
or Christianity like would not have occurred in America, or let alone survive,
Yeah, it
because
could
we
be.
just can't understand that.
Yeah.
Because how can like a secular rationalist atheist deist uh, construct of like what the European Enlightenment views as like the perfect country or the perfect religion,
Hmm.
is that how does the religion of Robespierre compare with that of the Bible? Is like it's two completely opposite things.
Right.
And because we're downwind of Robespierre, how in the world do we bridge the two? You can't.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that is, at least for me personally, it has been a 3.5 year, uh, almost 7 days a week slog through all of this material to um, uh, essentially take everything that I was taught over 40 years, push it off to the side of my mind, and go, okay, we're going to start all over again. As daunting as that sounds, I tell you, I can remember 3.5 years ago realizing that that's what it is that I needed to do, and I was almost overwhelmed. It was like I'll never be able to do this. Well, 3.5 years later, I can look back and I can go, yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, it was hard, it was difficult, and so I can look at other people and who have a kindergarten expectation out of church, every Sunday morning, that when they hear this kind of stuff, they're suddenly going, why do I need all of this? This sounds difficult. This sounds big. This sounds overwhelming. Yeah, it is. Which is why your best bet for most of you is probably to let other people do the hard work and ride on their coattails, but that puts the responsibility on those that want to do the hard work. You better do a good job, because you've got people that are trusting you and depending upon you. They're like children who are depending upon you to be the adult in the room and not steer them off into the ditch.
Right.
So, you know. But anyway, well, I think we've kind of taken this one out to just about every edge we can possibly take it. I think I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then we can talk about whatever we want. So, any last words, Nick, before I stop the recording? About where
No,
we're
we're
headed
running
next
out.
week?
Thank you all. See you next week.
Okay, excellent.